Surviving the Applewhites, Chapter 3. E.D. sat in the kitchen, pushing a mini-wheat around in the milk in the bottom of her bowl, trying to let the shaft of early sunlight that fell across the table cheer her up. She wasn't crazy about mini-wheats, but it was the only kind of cereal left in the house. She'd put her favorite kind on the list, but it was her father's turn to do the grocery shopping, and he'd forgotten. Again. A dry leaf detached itself from the dying wildflower arrangements in the middle of the table and drifted into her bowl. She fished it out. Cordelia had just gone through a flower arranging phase, and of course her arrangements had been beautiful. She was a true Applewhite after all, which meant that whatever creative activities she put her mind to, she did it really well. But she'd gotten bored with flower arranging, and now the bouquets were blackening all over the house. By the time anybody did anything with them, there'd be nothing left but dry, empty stems and slimy water. By then, even Cordelia probably wouldn't remember how they'd gotten there. There was a disturbing lack of focus and follow-up in her family. Edie didn't know how she could have been born an Applewhite. She wasn't anything at all like the rest of them. Even her mother and Aunt Lucille, who were only Applewhites by marriage, were more like them than she was. Applewhites were enormously talented. She was not. Applewhites thrived on chaos. Edie wanted organization and sense. Applewhites loved spontaneity. Edie wanted a schedule and a plan that she could count on. Applewhites craved freedom. Edie wanted structure. It was way too early for her to be up, but she'd wakened before dawn from nightmares she couldn't quite remember, except that Jake Simple had been in them. She hadn't been able to get back to sleep. This was the day he would be moving in. The Applewhites were determined to find the good kid under the bad exterior. It didn't seem to occur to them that the kid might be bad all the way through. His own grandfather, a man who looked a little shell-shocked, seemed all too eager to get rid of him. Hadn't anyone noticed that? Edie spooned the last mini-wheat into her mouth, put the bowl on the floor for Winston, who was sleeping noisily at her feet, and then sat elbows on the tables, chin resting on her fists, staring into the early sunlight. Yesterday, after the goats had been rounded up and her 4-year-old brother Destiny had been found digging for pirate treasure between the circle of carrots and the circle of tomatoes in Lucille's vegetable garden, there had been a family meeting. Everyone had been there except, of course, her older brother, Hal. Hal was not just a typical introverted artist. Sometime in the last year, he had become an actual recluse. He didn't come out of his room, except as far as anyone could tell, in the middle of the night, when he was reasonably certain everyone else would be asleep. The point of the family meeting had been to outline the plan for Jake's assimilation into the Creative Academy. It was worse than she'd feared. He was going to be in her class. This ought to have been an impossibility. The Creative Academy did not have classes. One of the main reasons the Creative Academy had been started in the first place was to avoid what her father called clumping. Applewhites, he said, shouldn't be required to do what other people did just because other people did it. Applewhites weren't like other people. It had all started when Cordelia was in 7th grade at Treybridge Middle School and was told by a teacher that she wasn't allowed to paint a zebra black and purple, because zebras were really black and white. The fact that the zebra in question was part of a science report, not an art project, hadn't made any difference to Randolph Applewhite. Real science demands creativity and individuality, he had told the principal when he withdrew his 3 older kids from the school district the very next day. Without creativity and individuality, there would be no scientific discovery, no Galileo, no Newton, no Einstein. If her father had been safely off directing a play somewhere when the zebra issue came up, she and Cordelia, and even Hal, might still be going to school in Treybridge, to a regular school with schedules and organization and a great many normal people, including Melissa, her best friend, whom she never got to see in person anymore. But Randolph hadn't been off directing. He had been at home with time on his hands. Worse, a theater company that had hired him to direct a play for them had called only that morning to tell him they had decided not to do the play. so they didn't need him after all. He was feeling rejected. Artists were tricky enough to handle when their work was going extremely well. Rejected artists could be downright dangerous. Within a week, the Creative Academy had been registered with the State Department of Education and was up and running. It had turned out to be quite easy to start a homeschool in North Carolina. All that was required was a guarantee that the teachers had high school diplomas. That was no problem. The academy teachers were the Applewhite adults, and all of them except Uncle Archie had finished college. Even Uncle Archie, who had dropped out of high school to travel the world on a tramp steamer, had eventually gotten a GED so that he could enroll in art school for a while. It hadn't been necessary to file a curriculum with the state, which was a good thing because the Applewhites didn't believe in telling the children what to study and when. The Creative Academy wasn't so much a home school as it was an unschool. Its students were supposed to follow their own interests and create their own educational plans, separately, individually, creatively. That meant that, except for ED, nobody had any sort of educational plan at all. And of course, nobody was ever doing the same thing as anybody else at the same time. Until now. Now, Jake was supposed to follow ED's plan. She didn't want him to. She had created her plan just for her. She had thought it up for herself, and she wanted to accomplish it by herself. She might not have talent, she might not have a creative bone in her body, but she wasn't half bad at learning. She had reminded the family about the Academy's philosophy, about individuality, the case against clumping. But she could have saved her breath. She and Jake Semple were a class. Part of the reason was math. Up till yesterday, she'd liked math. Nobody else in the family did. 2 and 2 added up to 4 no matter who added them, and they went right on adding up to 4 month after month and year after year. It's what ED had always liked about it. Everybody else found it boring. If homeschooled kids didn't have to take standardized tests once a year, tests that included math, ED felt sure there wouldn't be any math learned at the academy at all. Since they did have to take those tests, they took math online. ED was exactly where Jake Semple's last report card from the school he'd burned down said he was. 7th grade. Geometric problem solving. Comparing percentiles and fractions. Edie pulled another dry leaf from the dying bouquet. She had told him that she was willing to be clumped with Jake for math, just not everything else. But it hadn't done any good. Jake Semple needed to do cooperative learning so he could become better socialized, they said, and she was the only genuinely cooperative member of the family. Besides, he wasn't the sort of person yet who could be expected to come up with his own structure and organization. He needs to begin, at least, with yours, Zebediah had said, and that had been that. Edie thought of the fat 3-ring binder that held her curriculum for the first half of this year. It gave her life order, stability, predictability. It had taken her a whole week in August to plan it out. There were sections for each subject, and for each one she had written down her goals and listed every project she planned to do to meet those goals. Then she'd made charts and timelines with squares to check off each step as it was completed. So far, she was right on schedule. If she had to catch Jake Semple up on what she had done in each subject so far, it would throw everything into chaos. Winston was awake now, lying with the stubby front paws on each side of the cereal bowl, lapping up milk and leaking foamy saliva on Edie's sneakers and his own ears. Edie sighed. She loathed and despised chaos.